Well, welcome everyone. It's great to have you join us from Turkey, from Russia, from Germany, and a great international audience as usual. My name is Nick Buxton. I'm the Future Labs coordinator at the Transnational Institute. And we're really glad to have you join us to the sixth and final webinar in our series on China and the world. The series is being hosted by Transnational Institute and was sponsored by a number of organizations: Hongqiao.org, Made in China Journal, Lausan, Critical China Scholars, and the Asia-Europe People's Forum. The focus of today's session is on the biggest challenge we face as a world, and that is the environmental crisis, both the climate change and the collapse of biodiversity that we face. Now, in international media and politics, China is most often painted as the polluting bogeyman whose coal plants are destroying our planet and whose right to development threatens us all. But we know also that most of these portrayals are levied by the leaders of the richest countries to hide their own primary responsibility for the environmental crisis we face. It is, after all, the richest countries like the US, like the UK, like Australia, like France and Germany, who are responsible for more than half of global emissions historically since 1850. Even today, an average US citizen emits twice as much as an average Chinese citizen. And we are all worldwide consuming Chinese products and goods that come with environmental and climate costs. At the same time, for us, it's clear that our world cannot tackle the greatest crisis that it has faced without China, without its government and its people. There is no nation, China included, that is doing what is required to address our climate emergency. As we saw most recently at COP26 last month, no one is taking the action we desperately need, which is why we felt it was really important to include this session in our series. So briefly, today's session will examine China in the environmental crisis, both the domestic challenges its economic model has posed, as well as its contribution to global environmental impacts. And it will look at China's progress in areas such as renewable energy, as well as its failures and shortcomings. And it will look at what truly international cooperation with China would look like that could deliver the action on the scale and urgency we need. I'm really glad that we have four great speakers lined up for today to share their perspectives and knowledge. We have Isabel, and I'll introduce them briefly now and in a bit more detail later. Isabel Hilton, who's founder and senior advisor of China Dialogue. Hongqiao Liu, an independent journalist who's been covering climate change in China for more than a decade. Ying Chen, who's at the New School and co-author of the Global Green New Deal, A Global South Perspective. And Tobita Chow, activist and founder of Justice is Global. The format of our session will have first two speakers and then open up for some comment and questions and answers from the other panelists. And then we'll have the next two speakers again with chances for comments and questions and answers. We hope this will allow everyone to have the chance to raise their questions. If you have any questions, do put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen and use the chat to share your own thoughts, your own perspectives, useful resources, which is also what we will be doing, using the chat for. We're gonna, without further ado, I'd like to pass over now to our very first speaker, Isabel. Isabel is a long-term friend of TNI. She's a London-based journalist and founder of the China Dialogue Trust, which has published on China's climate and environmental challenges and is a really key resource, which I highly recommend, and has been publishing since 2006. China Dialogue is an independent, not-for-profit organization that publishes now in 9 languages across 4 platforms. And Isabel's going to give us a little, it's going to be a gallop through of China and the environmental issues it has faced in the last 2 decades. Over to you, Isabel. Very glad to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Nick. And just let me make sure I share the right bit. My job was to have a quick gallop through where China is in terms of its climate and environmental policy, and I thought it might be helpful just to take a quick historical view. China's development choices, China becomes an issue in international climate policy around the time of Deng Xiaoping's opening up and reform push, which follows 1989 Tiananmen. So the 80s have been experiments in reform. It's the post-Mao period, looking at history, cultural experimentation, all kinds of things which end up in Tiananmen Square. And after that, there's a pause. Deng Xiaoping then relaunches the opening up and reform period. And the deal is that the party essentially says to people, we will make you better off, but stay out of politics. There won't be political reform, but there will be economic reform. And so the priority from then on was very rapid GDP growth, the high carbon development, pollute first, clean up later, very much the Asian model, something that had been pursued with great success by other Asian tigers. So Taiwan, Japan, South Korea had all followed this model, and it was essentially a model that has its roots, of course, in the British Industrial Revolution and followed pretty much by everybody else since then. It has a speeded up version by the time we get to the 20th century because of the existence of global markets and various other things. So, and actually a lot of internal investment. So that's what happens. It's highly successful, but it has problems. It is fueled, of course, by coal. And coal, why coal? Well, that's what China has. It's not a cost-free option because there are very heavy costs to, for example, water nexus. China's very short of water. Coal used a lot of water. It was a big burden on the transport system. And it was also a great contributor to air pollution. So by the time we, get well into the 21st century, that's beginning to be an issue. And this is what happened in China's cities. It was beginning to happen really by the middle of the first decade of the century, but it escalated till 2012, 2013, you had really serious smog events. So you have a newly urbanized middle class, much more prosperous, with their one child in their newly built flat, with their slightly higher value jobs in many cases. And they were living in cities in which the air was barely breathable. And they began to object to this. So the protests against pollution, which you begin to see from the early 2000s, escalate and have, again, a lot of success. So you have an emerging middle class with a growing environmental consciousness. You also have an emerging formal, if you like, social movement around environment. So the first NGOs are beginning to flex their relatively small muscles, but relatively influential. There are a lot of journalists involved in these early environmental movements, and they carry a weight of influence, beyond, if you like, the ordinary citizen. And there were also many sympathetic officials who were working conscientiously in things like the Environmental Protection Agency with almost no political or economic power. And so they made alliances across society. They made alliances with new civil society organizations and with the general public to try to add weight to what they were trying to do, which was to get some regulation into China's industrial sector. They were trying to move a very large mountain because although the EPA as a national body had powers, they were technically sitting at the head of a pyramid of environmental protection bureaus at local and provincial level. And those bureaus worked to the same provincial authorities. They were financed by the provincial authorities. They were regulated by the provincial authorities. And those authorities had a direct stake in the economic growth of their provinces and in many of the industrial enterprises that were doing the pollution. So it was a system that essentially didn't work, and it didn't work partly by design because the priority was growth at all costs. But that was beginning to cause a lot of discontent. And around this time, they don't publish the figures anymore, but there were around 80,000 serious environmental protests a year by, in the middle of the first decade of the 20th century. So it was beginning to be a political problem. And then there was climate. So China had always been part of the UN process on climate. It was the non-Annex 1 signatory to the Kyoto Protocol. And actually, you know, at the time of the Kyoto Protocol, China's emissions were almost negligible. They were not a major factor in the discussion. But because of the industrial model that we've just seen, by 2005, China crosses that threshold emitter by volume. Now, there are many ways to count emissions. As you know, there's historical emissions, Nick has outlined that, per capita emissions. And so China used those arguments to say, well, yes, we are the biggest emitter by volume now, but you know, historically, it's not our responsibility, or indeed per capita emissions are still low. However, in policy circles, it was understood that China's position as a leader, if you like, of emerging economies and vulnerable countries was going to have to be recalibrated once China became the biggest emitter, because it wasn't a very good look. And indeed, in Copenhagen, at the catastrophic Copenhagen COP, there was a moment of confrontation between the Marshall Islands, highly vulnerable small island state, and China, which essentially said, China, you know, you will become our problem, or you are our problem now, along with the other big industrial emitters. So China then began to educate the Central Committee and the Politburo on climate change, and a climate policy began to emerge. Not least because China is also a highly vulnerable country. Most of it, the highly developed infrastructure, is in climate vulnerable regions. Think of the Pearl River Delta, think of Shanghai, think of Shenzhen. These Delta cities are extremely vulnerable. And in any event, China suffers from imbalances in its natural resources, which are very constraining. So in the north, there's a constant shortage of water, constant extreme floods in the south. And all of these things are going to be negatively affected by climate change, along with the cryosphere of the Qinghai Tibet Plateau, which is the source of the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. So this vulnerability in terms of China's future prosperity and future development also became a factor. And this all coincided with the moment when China's rapid catch-up industrial model was running out of steam. And China was getting to that point that all the previous tigers had got to, when you say, okay, we've done the rapid catch-up phase, we've moved people off the land, we're beginning to lose those first mover advantages, and we have to move up the economic value chain and up the technology chain. So all of this coincided to begin formulating a new industrial policy, a new economic policy, and a new focus because of climate change, because of the opportunity climate change represented and the threat to China, on low carbon technologies. So from the beginning of the 12th five-year plan, we see China's investment and focus shift into the kind of technologies that a carbon-constrained world is going to need to make that energy transition. And at that point, China buys directly into an investment in a low-carbon world. Because it wants to be the primary supplier of goods and services to that world, and that remains the basis of the industrial policy. That doesn't necessarily mean that domestic mitigation is going fast enough. This, if you like, is one branch of the policy. But at the same time, China begins to develop techniques and develop the administrative capacity, if you like, to count and eventually mitigate its own emissions. So again, you see a series of targets which are not necessarily directly productive of mitigation, but do lay the groundwork. So energy density, for example, is a favorite target, and we've seen that ratcheting up through the 12th, the 13th, and now the 14th five-year plan. So China's putting in place the mechanisms by which this transition would be made. And at the same time, it's investing enormously in its own renewable sector. So not just renewables, wind and solar, a huge growth in installed capacity, but the full range, including nuclear and perhaps more controversially, hydropower. All of these get a lot of attention in these plans. But China had gone so far down the fossil fuel route that it takes a long time to turn this tank around, and coal is still the dominant fuel. Now, one of the co-benefits of China's investment in renewables and China's capacity to manufacture at scale, China's efficiency in organizing supply chains and so on, China has brought down the cost of solar and other renewables for the rest of the world to a point where it is now cost effective in most geographies, more cost effective to think of establishing renewable systems from scratch rather than going through the high emitting, high carbon route. There are other complications. It's more complicated to manage a renewables grid, but nevertheless, in cost terms, the old argument that was still very much around and one still hears, that a developing economy needs coal because it needs that kind of energy to fuel its development, that need no longer be a real argument, because it is now, for a start, they're risking building stranded assets, but also the technology exists and it's a cost-effective technology thanks to China's ability to manufacture. And in the big moment of the evolution of China's own climate policy, of course, in 2020, Xi Jinping pledged at the United Nations to a target of carbon neutrality by 2060. The emissions peak before 2030, frankly, was not new and is a rather soft target, which was on the table in Paris. However, the carbon neutrality by 2060 pledge was new and was important, because from that point, we would anticipate that China's policies align with the 2060 target in mind. It was a bit of a disappointment that we didn't see that in the 14th five-year plan exactly. However, I think there are other factors at play which made the 14th five-year plan perhaps more cautious than some had anticipated. I just wanted to mention eco-civilization because this is another aspect of, if you like, the industrial and economic policy and the shift in priorities that we've seen in China from develop first, clean up later. This, if you like, is the cleanup mode, and this is an attempt to put an economy on a sustainable pathway. This is very much associated with Xi Jinping. It is embedded in the constitution, and we would expect it eventually to inform most industrial and economic decisions. This will take time. However, what has happened is that picture that I painted of a very weak environmental protection agency has pretty much been transformed. Since 2012, we've seen an evolution of the administrative capacity, not only to count and perhaps mitigate carbon emissions, but also to deal with industrial pollution, to deal with water and air pollution, soil pollution, to regulate companies and to punish companies that are serial polluters. And the rather forlorn Environmental Protection Agency is now a pretty powerful ministry of ecology and environment, and it has climate change under its in its portfolio. So it's been created as an important vehicle for a new approach embedded in Chinese industrial strategy. Now, has it gone far enough? Well, no, it hasn't. But then, as Nick said, nobody has. But it is, I think, the important message is that in this relatively short time, there has been an important shift in Chinese priorities, in how you measure progress, in how you measure prosperity, in how you assign value within your economy and within your society. And I don't expect that to go backwards in any way. So I will stop there. Oh, and I just, the video that Nick wanted to play was, perhaps you could press the button and I will explain why that video. Thank you so much, Nick. And that was just a time-lapse shot of what happened to air quality in Shijiazhuang, which is a fairly regular industrial city in Hebei province, and was happening all over China. And there were, although China didn't really declare a climate policy until later, air pollution was a really important driver because the party was having to cope with discontent in the population. And air pollution actually drove a lot of very positive improvements in Chinese policy, including much greater data transparency, much greater honesty in reporting pollution. There were a whole series of things which came out of the public reaction to air pollution and which continue in many ways to drive policy. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabel. That was an extremely impressive gallop through an awful lot of information, but really informative and insightful. So thank you for that really great grounder for this conversation. I'm now going to pass over to our second speaker, Hongqiao Liu is an independent journalist and consultant who's been covering climate change since 2010. She writes for a number of outlets, and her journalism is very much about bringing facts, nuance, and context to some of the heated discussions that go on about China and providing that information in digestible chunks, which she also did in a very impressive TED talk that we'll share in the chat. Hongqiao, thank you very much for joining us. I think we're going to turn to more specifically looking now at the China's climate policy, particularly in the light of course, COP26, which has just taken place a month ago. Over to you, Hongqiao.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I will just follow what just Isabel has recapped about China's climate policy. And from my side, I will give you a very quick overview in terms of data and what does China's climate policy actually mean in its context. The first point is that the rise of China is a very recent story. As you can see from this chart, this China's GDP data from World Bank. The so-called China miracle actually just happened in the last 20, 30 years, which was very fast. And China became the world's first biggest CO2 emitter was a story that happened 15 years ago. Just a moment, I can't switch. And back to the point about China being the world's largest emitter, Isabel also adjusted this. So you can see that when I was born, China's emission was really about half of the level of the US, and it took over the US, become the largest in 2006. Again, very recent story, and a lot of things has happened in the 15 years afterwards. And today, based on the most recent research from Carbon Brief, where I write on China's climate and energy policy, China is the world's second largest historical CO2 emitters, just after the US. And this is true in both the scenario that we count the emissions from land use and forest, and also after adjust the embedded, the virtual carbon or embedded carbon that is in the trade. The story of China being the world's factory of the world actually comes with a significance in and the implication in climate, in terms of climate and energy. Over the last 25 years, the embedded carbon, in carbon that were generated in the production, manufacturing, raw material, processing, etc. Of the goods that are produced and exported from China to other countries, account for about 5 to 20% of China's total energy consumption. And when I say this, it means territorial emissions in China. And when we look at China's climate goals today, China has promised, the most recent goals, the so-called dual carbon goals, was that China will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030. and China will achieve carbon neutrality, which is net zero, before 2060. And to put this into perspective, I present to you another trajectory from the EU 27. And you can see that in 2018, the emissions of China, it's about 3.5 times of the level of EU 27. And you can see that this emergent break that China has to take to tackle its emissions in achieving its climate policies, it's much more difficult in terms of the volume, the scale, and the speed that is required for its transition. And when China say that we have to achieve the dual carbon goal in a much shorter time period compared to other developed countries, it actually means that China will have to do it at probably half of the time compared to EU 27. And China's current energy structure is basically very, I mean, if I have to put one word to it, it would be it's extremely high carbon. 84% of China's energy mix, primary energy consumption comes from fossil fuels today. And that includes about 56.8 or roughly 57% of coal. And you can see, try to turn that to reduce that amount of fossil fuels, both in terms of share and also in absolute terms, will be extremely difficult. And coal has always been, the center of the discussion of China's, coal phase out or phase down or coal exit, however you describe it. The message from the Chinese government is that coal will be gone. It's just about time and about the speed and how we're going to deal with this 56% of coal in our energy structure in this transition. And back in 2015, I recall at that time in Paris, we were talking about a possible peak of coal consumption from China. And at that time, you can see, if you see the chart on the right-hand side, in 2014, China's coal consumption actually experienced a very small peak. And it continued to reduce and decline, but it's now bouncing back. And it's very likely, even after the pandemic, the COVID pandemic recovery, coal consumption might surpass what was peaked in 2014, but we have to see the data by the end of the year or early next year. So China has submitted its NDC, the National Determined Contribution under the Paris regime. And the first NDC was submitted in 2016. The second was just, ahead, a few days ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. And the slide is gone, excuse me. Sorry, a slide is gone, and I was about to explain to you the progress, actually, the progress of the two revised NDCs. So based on China's two NDC plans, it aims to cut the share of it intends to increase the share of non-fossil fuels from today's level of around 16% to 25% by 2060, and aim to further increasing to 80% by 2060. It also aimed to increase the forest stock volume, and the aims for 1,200 gigawatts of installed capacity for wind and solar. And the revised NDC, even though being criticized of lacking ambitions, it is an advancement compared to its 2016 NDC. But again, it's probably not enough to match the action that is needed today to meet 1.5 or 2 degree global target. But even though the calculation on this adjustment, if we only take this this target that is made in the NDC, which is the CO2 intensity reduction in 2030 in the NDC, if we follow the previous NDC, which is to reduce 60 to 65% of CO2 intensity that is measured by emissions per unit of GDP, we will see China's peak emissions by 2030 will be around 12,000 megatons. But with a revised NDC, it will be much lower, about 11, and combined with other NDC targets, including forest, including installed capacity for wind and solar, etc., it can be potentially reduced from 12.6 to 10.46 megatons of CO2. And just this, or just to give you a visual impression of what has to happen just to meet what is described on paper in the NDC, that China aims to increase, as I mentioned, the share of non-fossil fuels in its energy mix to 25% by 2030, and continue to grow it all the way to 80%. In its midterm and the long-term strategy. But according to scientists, modelers and advisors from Chinese government, the share can actually be, as high as 97% in a net carbon neutral, a carbon neutral 2060 scenario, which is shown on the right-hand side. The left-hand side, 91% is not that bad either. So the scale of China's transition, what does it actually mean? There are a lot of literatures trying to give, to outline the scale. What does it actually mean? So in terms of avoided emissions between 2020 to 2060 is roughly about the cumulative emissions that China has emitted in the past half century. It also means, China going net zero by 2060 could mean preventing a further 0.2 to 0.3 degree of global warming. And that is significant in a way that we are, before COP26, we were aiming for a trajectory of 2.6 degree of global warming. And that 0.2 to 0.3 degree that China can contribute, it's significant in a way that we're closer to the target of 2 degrees, but still, is it enough? We're going to talk about it later. And there's also this positive spillover effect that Isabel just mentioned. China, by massively deploying renewable energies and other low carbon technology, and also being a manufacturer and inventor, putting a lot of investment in the R&D, can actually bring down the cost of a low carbon technology all around the world. And again, it also has its own benefit to its GDP. And back to this question about whether this is enough. We've seen controversial assessments. The left one from Climate Action Tracker is more like mainstream in the English media, that is widely cited, that this study assessed China's dual carbon goals as highly insufficient for sending the world to a 3 to 4 degree warmer planet, basically, in the trajectory. And then from Energy Foundation China, their assessment basically, shown on the right-hand side, that China going net zero by 2060 is actually aligned with 1.5 degree trajectory in, climate modeling. And the hope is that the transition is happening. It's probably not up to speed, but it's happening. And we can probably, have hope that it might accelerate faster and happen in a larger scale. And what we've seen since 2010, as shown in this chart, that China almost doubled its GDP per capita if you follow the blue line. And while largely maintaining its a steady level of CO2 emissions per capita. And this is not a sign of a decoupling yet, but as China, turning the super tank around, this might happen in the future very soon. And I will stop there. I think I'm a little bit over time, and I will be happy to answer questions afterwards. And just to give you, if you are interested in following my articles for longer in-depth analysis or, just tweets, you can find me here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hongqiao. Again, a great overview of Chinese climate policy. I was wondering, Isabel, if you, and we'll now go to the other panelists as well, but Isabel, if you have any kind of quick additional comments or thoughts that you would
Yes,
add in from.
Thank you so much, Nick and Hongqiao. I think just to pick up on the question of whether China's mitigation actions will speed up as we hope they will. We haven't really mentioned geopolitics very much, but I think one of the reasons that the 14th five-year plan was perhaps disappointing in that it presupposed the continuing building of new coal in China, though as we know, Xi Jinping has announced the ending of the financing of coal on the Belt and Road. So if no new coal outside China, why quite so much new coal inside China? My reading, and Hongqiao may have a different view, we haven't discussed this, but I think one factor is the tensions between the US and China and the question of energy security. And security was much mentioned in all the speeches around the 14th five-year plan. And I think that if you are a Chinese planner and you're looking at potential conflict, then you take a cautious view. Coal is what you have. Perhaps you just want to hedge your bets a bit. So I think that the geostrategic questions and some fairly toxic politics on both sides actually are not being particularly helpful at the moment. There was a great moment in 2014, did I get that right? When Obama and Xi Jinping shook hands and agreed to work together towards an agreement in Paris. And that was, picking up the momentum that had failed in Copenhagen and led to this very important moment in Paris when we did get a new deal, new agreement, and a new set of pledges. Since then, as we know, things have taken a rather different turn. The US and China are barely cooperating. But one of the positive moments in Glasgow was the announcement that, yes, they continue to talk, and yes, there is a bilateral willingness to cooperate. I think it's fairly limited. And I think that on each side, closer cooperation remains constrained by popular nationalism. So we have the leftover of the Trump administration and right-wing republicanism, which tends to be more climate skeptic and very hostile to China. And on the Chinese side, we have also a fairly militant nationalism and an unwillingness to be seen to do what foreigners want. So if the United States calls on China to do something, you can be pretty sure that China won't respond positively. If China is going to advance its climate actions, it's going to do it on its own terms, in its own, at its own pace, and announce it in the fora of its choosing. So I think we need to bear that in mind as we look at what China does and says.
Thank you, Isabel. Ying or Tobita, do you have anything you would like to add at this point? Just any short additional reflections?
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I want to mention that I really appreciate both speakers mentioning about how China's rise as a carbon emitter, as the largest carbon emitter, is a recent phenomenon, and particularly it is becoming more explicit since the economic reform, but more so after China actually joined WTO and started to engage in the global division of labor. So I think that part is very important, and later in my own presentation, I'll also elaborate a little bit more on that, and just in approaching this whole climate change issue in China with respect to its own development model and its own economic system.
Thank you. And I have a question I'd like to put in here, because you mentioned this a little bit, Isabel, earlier on about the protests against air pollution. I was wondering, and it came up also in one of the questions which has been asked about awareness about China's vulnerability to climate change, how much that's also leading to kind of a social and popular pressure for action on climate change. And so I was wondering what had happened to the environmental movements that we heard about in the early 2000s, also the cancer villages where people were reporting very high levels of cancer. What what has happened to those movements? How is, and as someone put in the question answers, how are people's concerns about climate change, are they live, and how are they channeled through in terms of currently in terms of policy? And
Sure.
perhaps I could start with Hongqiao, and then first on this.
The climate move, the environment movement.
Yeah, the popular movements that were around in the early 2000s who were expressing a lot of concern about pollution.
Yeah, I started covering China environment and climate in around 2010. So I probably missed the golden era where when a lot of protests actually took place. My sense was that I witnessed and participated as a reporter, as a journalist in China, the movement on the protests and the calling for better air, clean water, and a healthy soil. A lot of my earlier days investigation were actually about contaminated soil, water, and air. And I saw at that time, even in China, in that political environment and setting, there were a positive dynamic between the civil society, which was considerably larger compared to today, probably smaller than most of the rest of the world. The interaction between civil society and journalists, when our coverage disclose or reveals some major problems about China's environment, civil society groups pick it up. They trace the government. They seek accountabilities, asking for more data, asking for more actions. And I have to say, I think at that time, I was quite hopeful that there was this positive, as I said, interaction. But then very quickly, the situation in China has changed. I won't say overnight, but it's changed gradually, and it became much less possible to have this interaction, to maintain this action, because both journalism, independent journalism, and civil society were put in a very difficult situation for survival. But at the same time, environment, climate, or energy transition, the issues that civil society have been calling for, change, have become embedded into the government agenda and have been absorbed in the government agenda that became one of the top priorities of the Chinese government. And that also changed the dynamic, because civil society today, if they want to contribute, participate, they will have to, in a way, approach the government, follow the agenda, and contribute within this framework that the government is setting. I think probably Ying and Isabel might have different contributions on that, but I think this is my observation. It's hard to say whether this is good or not at this point, but definitely I would expect to see more, a more interactive system, an ecosystem where both journalists, civil society can have a bigger role to play in this transition. And I will stop there.
Tobita, I don't know if you were wanting to jump in here. I think I saw you briefly. Then I'll go back to Isabel. I think you also wanted to make a brief comment on that.
Absolutely, and Hongqiao's sketch of the trajectory is absolutely right. There was an explosion of self-organized groups in the first decade, and that relationship that I touched on between rather weak state entities that were also trying, that saw themselves with common cause with civil society. They were trying to rein in big polluters, and they were also really fighting vested interests, not just in industrial enterprises, but in the administrative units and the government units that depended on the revenues and had close relationships with those industrial enterprises. Now, and those were very powerful groups. A lot of them were campaigning against big hydro. There was a big movement, including a lot of journalists who campaigned against damming of the remaining rivers. That battle was pretty much lost. Other battles were won. The air pollution battle was pretty much won with much more transparency and accountability and honest data, because honestly, you know, Chinese entities used to just hide the data, but that is no longer possible because you can carry around a digital monitor yourself, and you know, so we now know what's happening in Chinese cities, and that meant that a lot of, you know, cleanup had to happen, and so the air is on the whole very much better than it was. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than it was. Soil pollution was actually a state secret. The extent of soil pollution was a state secret in China when we first started looking at it in 2007. That again has progressed. There is much more acknowledgement of it. There isn't really an awful lot in the way of remediation because it's expensive, but at least it's acknowledged. And that means that efforts to control further pollution are the more rigorous. The state has set up a whole series of more robust mechanisms, including use of the inspection system, big fines, punishment, actually punishing officials for lying about the environmental consequences, and I think quite importantly, attaching environmental damage permanently to the record of a bureaucrat. So you can't just do some damage, get promoted, move out of the district and leave it behind. It will follow you. And that really changes the way people think about, you know, how to prioritize environmental protection. But the negative side is that now the state, as it were, has taken this on board, and the party has taken this on board and is now, you know, proclaiming itself as the champion of eco-civilization. It has also really constrained civil society, both international NGOs who are very, very much, they're really suffering from very, very tight new laws and the difficulty of registering and operating legally, and also being attacked by Chinese nationalists, which all of that's happening. And local NGOs, which are now finding it harder to get funds, but have also been subject to much, much tighter regulations. And this used to be a kind of permitted space, and it is no longer. The party sees independent action, particularly protest or organization, as a threat. So unless you are the kind of social organization that is a service provider, you're going to have an increasingly tough time.
Thank you, Isabel. I will come to you in the Ying in a moment. There's a couple of questions, and perhaps you could tie this into your answer as well, Ying, but about ecological civilization, to what extent the rhetoric has been put into practice. And one question specifically, that a lot of the focus seems to be, from your presentation, Hongqiao, about replacing fossil fuels with non-fossil fuel sources. But there's also big debates internationally around different levels of consumption, degrowth, different ways of measuring development that looks at quality of life rather than economic growth. To what extent are those debates also existing and articulated in China and perhaps with different formulations and so on? So I'll go to Ying first, but if anyone else wants to address that, then do just wave your hand at me. Ying, over to you. And do share what you were going to share anyway.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was going to comment on activism, actually, if you don't mind. So I think it's really important that the information that Hongqiao and Isabel just discussed, I think a lot of people here would agree that, most of the important historical changes usually came from, receiving pressure from the grassroots movement. And I think for ecological issues, this is going to be no exception. And I remember when I was in grad school, that was probably 10 years ago, and when I was doing research and looking at all the protests happening in mainland China, environmental concern was actually the #1 reason for people to, go on street or to go to local government and to make complaints. But I think right now, with the government starting to make policies to address climate change issues, I think the picture of activism might become more complicated, and it's very likely to see a lot of conflict of interest among people in different sections of activism. For example, government's tackle on coal, war on coal, right? The policies to reduce coal production, consumption, is largely in line with the popular demand to address air pollution issue. But at the same time, tackling on coal and also try to reduce fossil fuel production would lead to worker displacement from those traditionally fossil fuel sectors. So in that sense, there is some conflict of interest among people from different social background, from different occupation. So this really would pose a big challenge for the activists involved. And so instead of focusing on single issue, I think it would be really important for activists to think about broader coalition strategies. And also, I think in terms of not just domestic concern, but international as well, right? So when people are going to went on the street to protest against, say, foreign capital or domestic capital in polluting local rivers, are they going to be satisfied if the factory is moving abroad, right? Or should there be international solidarity as well, that none of these factories should exist anymore in any corner of the world? So I think these are all going to be very serious questions for people to think about. That's my comment. Thank you,
Ying. Yeah, and I hope we'll address some of those in a bit more depth as we continue this conversation. Thank you. Does anyone want to address the issue of ecological civilization? Would anyone like to speak to that? And whether it goes beyond just a replacement of energy sources. Hongqiao.
Yeah, I will have a very quick comment. So the philosophy, the so-called development concept of ecological civilization was really, as Isabel outlined, is really part of the seed thought, Xi Jinping thought. And this package of seed thought has been evolving since ecological civilization was first introduced. And today, what we see the most is the so-called new development philosophy, which covers the dual carbon goals, high quality growth, and also ecological civilization, etc. And in this context, when we talk about, I think you also mentioned about degrowth and such narratives as such. China has made it very, very clear we are an emerging economy. We are still the world's biggest developing country. Development is the fundamental principle of every policy that we are making, and this is the fundamental goal. And achieving that is to fulfill the domestic demand of our people, common prosperity, etc. So development will stay, but China is proposing an alternative, the so-called, I think people might have different views on this alternative development path to other Western developed countries, and that is today elaborated as a new development philosophy. Unfortunately, I can't comment more on that because the concept itself is not very well defined even today. But in short, this is a package of this new development source that China is exploring a different path. But how will this path look like? There's many uncertainties, and what we know for sure is that it wouldn't be the same as we've seen elsewhere, and that dual carbon goals, the transition, the climate and the energy transition will stay at the center of this new development path.
Thank you, Hongqiao. We're now going to go
add something very quickly.
Yeah, quickly as well. But
yeah, absolutely. Which is that a lot of the changes I think that we will see in China's carbon profile are structural, or economic and industrial structures are changing. So China's moving away. I mean, it's built its infrastructure in a big high emitting sector. It's trying to move to a service economy, to more domestic consumption. So all of those are going to have a beneficial effect on emissions. So the debate in China on the economy is really, if we can't make the pie much bigger now, and we're entering a period of much lower growth, then how do we share it out more equitably? So that has been the focus of a lot of the economic discussions. So I think we're just, China is undergoing an important shift, and that will have climate effects regardless of the policy of, how explicitly these are climate policies.
Great, thanks, Isabel. That's a helpful addition. I'm now going to pass the floor to Ying Chen, who's been particularly thinking about, has done some thinking around global Green New Deal and what that looks like from a Southern perspective, and what it would look like if it really properly integrates China, and what are some of the challenges that we face in terms of one of the biggest schemes and formers that's been put together for the kind of rapid, large-scale transition, systemic transition we need. Ying Chen is Assistant Professor of Economics at the New School for Social Research in New York. She has studied economic development, labor, and climate change with a special focus on the Global South, and has published in many journals and being consulted for the publication of the UNCTAD Trade and Development Report this year in 2021. And we're really glad to have you with us, Ying Chen. Over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Can everyone see the slides fine? All good? All right, thank you. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to discuss such an important issue with everyone here. So like Nick introduced, I study political economy, economic development, and also I teach and do research in comparative economic system. So for me, the way I approach climate change issues largely from political economy perspective, and I also try to view climate change policies not so much as a result of the political will of the policymakers, but rather as a result of the constraining economic system and the development model that China is adopting, as well as the global, its own position in the global division of labor. So I'm going to start my presentation with just sharing you a few numbers. Oh, sorry, it's here. And to, first of all, let's just think a little bit about what these numbers represent, and then I'm gonna give the answer to that. So basically, the first two sets of the number are something that Nick already mentioned. It should be occurring in the mainstream media a lot, right? 27% is what China is responsible for in terms of carbon emission, total carbon emission, and more than 50% is what China also is responsible for in terms of the coal consumption as a share of the entire world. 1.4 billion is China's population, so per capita wise, its emission is about 10.1 tons compared to what US has as 17 tons. So I think that's also something that Nick already mentioned. And as Hongqiao also talked about, all these data is usually about production-based territorial data, which means that what is getting burned and used within the mainland China's territory would be counted towards China's emission. But oftentimes some other scholars would challenge this approach instead to bringing the so-called per capita consumption based data, which actually is based on the understanding that when globalization and outsourcing became more convenient for capital, the developed world can easily outsource the carbon intensive activities to the developing world. So we should actually hold accountable of people who are the end consumers of those products. So even if coal, fossil fuel energies are not used in those countries, but eventually it benefits the consumption of those countries. So consumption-based data shows a very different picture. As you can see here, the G7 countries basically have a very high level of per capita emission. The emerging economies, as you can see in the corner here, is comparatively low, relatively low, China still being the highest among all these emerging economies though. Coming back, 400 billion tons. This is the historical emission of the United States since the 18th century, and 25% is what US is responsible for historically. 28% is EU as a whole that is responsible in terms of the share of the total historical emission. So I think you probably noticed that there is some difference between the data that I presented here versus what Hongqiao just talked about, as China as the second historical emitter. I'm going to comment on that. I think there is some interesting ways to construct data that will show very different results and probably lead to very different interpretation. The last set of data is what I really want to highlight here, 420. That's basically the remaining global carbon budget for the entire world, if we still want to make sure that we do not go beyond the 1.5 Celsius scenario. So this is what we still have left over. There are a lot of debates. Different scientists would come up with different estimates, but this is one of the estimates. So basically, if we want to make sure the Earth is still sustainable in some way, this is basically the limit of CO2 that the entire world can consume. And if we divide it by the entire world population, we'll see that this number, 348 tons, would be the lifetime carbon budget for a person who was born in the 1950s, assuming that person can live for about 85 years old. And then you see this 122 tons, which is a dramatically lower number, and that is a person who was born in 2017, and the lifetime carbon budget for that person, right? So it's only 50, 60 years apart, but you can see that the lifetime carbon budget that is allowed for people to consume has already dramatically declined. 43, even dramatic, more dramatic decline. That's, again, if we want to be very strict about 1.5 scenario rather than 2 Celsius degrees scenario, this is going to be the remaining carbon budget for a person who was born in 2017, assuming that the person is going to live for about 85 years old. And you can see from this graph, this is basically the trajectory of the lifetime budget. As you can see, US, Europe, China, and India, there is a dramatic decline of the carbon budget that people were born from different years are allowed to have. And you can see for all this country, there is going to be a convergence of living style, basically. But for the rich country, there's going to be an expected decline in terms of carbon consumption. So yeah, historical data, I think we already talked about. So let me move on to the next slide. So the reason, let me just go back a little bit, of showing these data is to actually to encourage you to think about which set of the data, which set of the numbers do you see most often from mainstream media? And you probably will realize by now that although these indicators are equally important, most often these data are selectively presented in the mainstream media in a way to support discussion, proposals, and solutions that will have the minimal impact on the Western living style. So the elephant in the room really for me is this pressing global carbon budget. And if we calculate it backwards, it's very clear who will need to really cut emissions fast. But I think, as you can see from most of the discussion, changing lifestyle seems to be something that people would avoid discussing, especially when it applies to the Western context. So in a way, I think it's very important to realize this context that there is a tendency for Western domination in shaping the narratives on the climate change question. And I think it largely distorts the question that we should be asking and therefore affect the solutions that we are possibly able to offer. So I think that's a very important context to keep in mind when we start to talk about what China has done to address the ecological crisis versus the mainstream interpretation of it. So I think my colleagues on the panel has already talked a lot about the details of policy. So I'm just going to be very brief that China over the years has adopted industrial policies to support the development of renewable energy, particularly solar and wind power, and these days electric vehicles as well. So right now it has become the leading producer and an investor in all three areas, solar, wind, and electric vehicles. And these industrial policies are typical industrial policies like public financing, government subsidies, local content requirement, research and development support, something that you will hear from late industrializers, for example, South Korea, right, when it started to develop. So it was typically used in late industrializer countries where state is strong and highly involved in the development process to boost economic development. But I think it's important to realize that although the state is highly involved, it still only serves as the facilitator. And so eventually the process of development of all these renewable energy and electric vehicles are within the framework of the capitalist market economy. And that itself has a lot of contradictions, which I'm going to talk about very soon. Okay. So this, since I mentioned that most of the
Ying,
strategy,
yes. You have 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. So the limits of some of the climate policies, as well as some of the remaining issues and obstacles that we need to keep in mind, is that, first of all, there is going to be worker displacement from the fossil fuel sector. And this is expected. The Minister of Human Resources estimated that there's going to be an elimination of 1.3 million jobs in the coal sector and 500,000 in the steel industry. Although the government promised that they will set aside some funding for relocation and retraining, there is still a lot of concern about this whole process because it just sounded so familiar. It just sounded so much like the massive layoff during the privatizations in the early 1990s. So I think a lot of the activists are very much concerned about those that process. My own research shows that although there's going to be loss of jobs in the traditional fossil fuel sectors, due to the labor-intensive nature of renewable energy sector, we're going to actually expect net job increase because there's going to be more jobs that's going to be created in the renewable energy sector than that is lost in the fossil fuel sector. However, that's only about the quantity aspect. Quality-wise, we're not sure, but my other research shows that probably more than half of those new jobs are going to be in the informal sector, which means precarity, which means low wage, which means little benefit. So I think this is also something that we need to really consider. Other barriers that is not domestic, but more international, I would say the first thing is that the developed world is not really providing a very good role model so far. One example being that they failed to fulfill the promise of providing this 100 billion climate finance to the developing world. And the second point I want to mention is that because of China's current position in the global division of labor, which really is in Wallerstein's term, in the semi-periphery status, that China's overall profitability is very low, so that worker exploitation is very heavy. And if that structure doesn't change, then it doesn't matter what kind of investment that China is making. Worker exploitation could still be a serious issue, even in the green sector. And the third point I want to mention is that due to the global competition among capitals, international collaboration will have a lot of barriers because profitability is still the de facto goal. So even if technology is developed, we probably will not be expecting to see very fast spread and adoption of those technology at the speed that it should be. And this could be seen from the COVID case where, you know, we see vaccines being developed, but there are a lot of barriers for them to be spreaded quickly to the world and to people who most need it. Last slide's conclusion. Basically, I think the discussion of capitalism's internal structure, internal contradiction is largely missed in the mainstream proposals of climate solution, and therefore a lot of the social consequences that is more likely to occur in the global south are not really in the center of the discussion. And in the case of China, as I mentioned, the strategies that it has adopted to fight against climate change still largely fall within the capitalist model, and therefore a lot of problem with respect to labor exploitation that are often associated with capitalism should be expected to occur. And last but not least, I think it's very important for people to understand more thoroughly about China's economic system and its position in the global division of labor to fully assess the climate change policies. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Nick,
I think you froze.
Yeah, I think Nick's having some technical issues there. So we'll move forward and hopefully he'll come back to join us. So we might move straight into Tobita's. Nick, you're back. I think he's still having some issues. So we might move straight into Tobita's presentation. So Tobita Chow is the founding director of Justice is Global, a special project of people's action to build a just and sustainable global economy and defeat right-wing nationalism. He is a leading progressive strategist regarding the US-China relationship. So Tobita, I think we'll hand over to you. Thanks very much, Ying, for your presentation. And Tobita, we can hand over to you and we'll come back with questions after.
Thank you. It's great to be here. This has been just an absolutely fantastic series. I'm going to focus my comments on the need and the potential for greater international cooperation around climate, and in particular between the US and China. And I would like to start by telling a story of an example of US-China cooperation on climate finance and tech sharing. So 2 years ago, China was in talks with a US-led multilateral development bank, and they were talking about how they would work together to create a new fund that would finance clean energy projects in a certain region of the developing world. And these two parties, China and this US-led development bank, were working out a deal in which China would provide a large amount of capital to finance clean energy development and would also share technological know-how around clean energy manufacturing. So this would draw on some of China's key strengths when it comes to climate. So first, they're willing to put up large amounts of capital to finance development projects through the Belt and Road Initiative. And China is also by far a leader in a large number of clean energy industries. The US-led development bank, for its part, would provide lower interest rates than are available from China. It would also lead on labor and environmental standards, and all of the projects through this fund would be open to bids from US companies as well. So if this deal had gone through, it would have meant that the US and China would cooperate to accelerate climate action in developing countries in a way that would bring distinct benefits to stakeholders in all three countries. And it would have set a precedent for more ambitious forms of international climate cooperation. So those talks were underway a couple years ago, but the story has an unhappy ending. At the time, Trump was the president of the United States and in the middle of his trade war with China, and he heard about these talks and immediately quashed them. But this story does show how climate cooperation has the potential to accelerate international clean energy financing and tech sharing, and those are really important needs in global climate action. It also shows how rising nationalism and tensions between the US and China are threatening that kind of climate cooperation. And even worse, we're in a situation where many global South countries are feeling pressured to choose sides, that either they get development finance from the US or from China. This pressure to choose sides is currently coming from the US more so than from China, I would say. So for example, earlier this year, the US Senate passed a bill called the United States Innovation and Competition Act, which includes a provision that would put a condition on all loans through the Inter-American Development Bank, which is a US-led multilateral development bank that funds projects in Latin America. And what this act says is that any government in Latin America that accepts a loan through the Inter-American Development Bank has to promise never to take any loan from China after accepting this development loan from this US-led development bank. So this is pressuring countries to choose sides, which is very disastrous to their prospects for economic development and to their hopes of pursuing any kind of climate-friendly development. Okay, so that's one example of what US-China climate cooperation can look like and the emerging threats we're seeing to that sort of cooperation. Let's see, so different forms of climate cooperation that we would like to see that I think are important to the planet. That was an example of cooperation around climate finance and also clean energy tech sharing. This kind of cooperation could also take the form of collaboration on Belt and Road initiatives. The US and also the EU could engage in collaboration on the Belt and Road initiative to help green the BRI, which is a stated goal from China to green the BRI. Oops, hold on. Another form of climate cooperation that I think we need to see is around debt relief. This is another crucial need for the Global South. It's a need for Global South economic development in general, and is also really important for their ability to engage in climate action. And we need cooperation here because heavily indebted countries in the Global South are currently getting stuck in the middle of disputes between Chinese and Western creditors. This happened in Zambia a year ago. Zambia was in talks for debt relief, but Western creditors refused to provide debt relief out of suspicion that Chinese creditors would then benefit. And this led to a stalemate in debt relief talks. And as a result, Zambia defaulted on its debt. Apologies if you can hear the yard work outside my window. Yeah. We also need changes to global rules, and there is a need for international cooperation from the US, China, and other powerful countries to make this happen. The rules of the neoliberal global economy, which are upheld through Bretton Woods institutions, the WTO, and trade agreements and so on, are in many cases severe obstacles to climate action. A couple of changes we need is we need to weaken the global intellectual property rights regime, particularly regarding clean technology. Ying just mentioned this as a problem. Like she said, that the same problems that we are seeing with intellectual property on COVID vaccines and other medicines also show up when it comes to technologies relevant to combating climate change. Global South countries find it expensive to access clean technology, often find it impossible to build their own clean energy industries because of the monopolies granted by the intellectual property rights regime. And the beneficiaries here are mainly capitalists in the US, Europe, and other global North countries although increasingly China this is also the case in China. We also need to increase the policy space for all countries to engage in green industrial policy, in different forms of state intervention into the economy, into implement environmental regulations. This all requires changes to global rules, and that requires international cooperation. In addition, we need collaboration on research and development in new clean technologies and in scaling up the manufacturing of clean energy industries. The progress that we have made so far in China and in the rest of the world is in large part due to a history of international collaboration. And Jonas Nahm has recently published a book about this called Collaborative Advantage, in which he shows that the development of wind and solar industries in the US, China, and Germany has already depended on a high level of collaboration between those three countries. And finally, we could see cooperation around carbon pricing and carbon tariffs. This currently gets the most attention from global North countries, but I very intentionally leave this to the end of the list. Carbon pricing and carbon tariffs can play a role in fighting climate change, but I think we have to be very careful about this because it can act as a purely punitive measure that threatens global South economies. Any carbon pricing, carbon tariff mechanism needs to be paired with these other measures that I've talked about before that support climate-friendly economic development in the global South. Otherwise, it is a simply punitive measure. It risks further alienating global South countries from the climate policies of the global North and does not actually help global South countries transition to towards climate-friendly economic development. Okay, so this is a list of different forms of climate cooperation that we need to see. These are all threatened by the growth of great power rivalry between the US and China. These growing tensions between the US and China don't only undermine cooperation, but even worse, they empower nationalist forces that can be hostile to climate action. We see this on the US right in just outright climate denialism. The growth of US-China rivalry empowers these right-wing nationalists, and they are just across the board the enemy of climate action. I think that this kind of political problem is, I feel, is less powerful in China, but in China as well, we see nationalists claiming that the calls for climate action are like a plot to undermine the Chinese economy. And that's a thing that leaders in China have to contend with. So this growing rivalry undermines cooperation and empowers forces that are hostile to climate action. So what do we do about it? Well, we need to build political power to promote these forms of cooperation and to stop measures that make things worse, which I would say include trade wars, the current emergence of new arms races in the Asia-Pacific region, and so on. In addition to pushing for better policies at the national level, I think it's also important to pursue cooperation at the subnational level. We can pursue cooperation through civil society. As was discussed earlier, sort of environmentalism in civil society in China is not what it used to do, not what it used to be, but there are still groups that work on environmental issues and on climate in China, and there is space to pursue greater cooperation with them. I think there can also be opportunities through governments at the subnational level. In the United States, at the local and state level, many governments, so state governments and the governments of certainly like any large city, have offices dealing with global economic relationships, including with China. And we can look to this as an avenue to push for alternative approaches to the US-China relationship as well. Let's see, just to, I want to close by looking at some polling data that shows that there are actually some political opportunities for this kind of politics in the United States. Anti-China sentiment has gotten very bad here in the US, but even so, there are some opportunities to build popular support and political support for these sorts of measures. This is some polling that was done earlier this year by Data for Progress in partnership with the Asia Society Policy Institute. Yes. A majority of voters in the US think that America should work with China.
Tobita, just to say we need to wrap up.
Okay. Majority of voters in the US think America should work with China to address climate change. Strong majority, 56%, that's the top line result. Overwhelming support among Democrats, less so among Republicans, of course. And let me skip to this last one. One other more specific form of this question, a majority of voters think that America should work with China and other countries to create a global green stimulus, which is quite a bold proposal. But when folks polled were asked about this, 59% overall supported it. And again, overwhelming support among Democrats and even plurality of support among independent voters. So even with the growth of nationalism and anti-China sentiment in the United States, there is still a space to build political support for US-China cooperation around our shared global challenges, including climate change. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Tobita, for also ending on a positive note. We're going to, before we open up for comments and discussion, we're going to show a little video. It comes from one of the Chinese climate striker. We're just going to show a short clip of that.
Whenever she can, Hongqiao visits the flower market in her home city of Guilin. With her pocket money, she buys tree seedlings to plant in the surrounding area. It's her contribution to the worldwide Fridays for Future protests, how he joined the movement 4 months ago. She is China's first climate striker.
Planting trees is something that's easy to do and something that's possible to promote in China.
Inspired by young people around the world, Howie started demonstrating in front of the local government offices. She was soon escorted away by the police, who warned her of serious trouble if she continued.
To keep going would have taken a lot of courage. So I'm hesitant about that. I don't consider myself especially brave.
Turning her back on activism was also out of the question. Now, several times a week, she's out planting trees and posting about her activities on social media. She hopes to convince more young Chinese to join the movement. University student Danny is with her today for the second time. The Chinese government has made improving the environment one of its key goals, but it keeps a tight lid on discussion. Howie became concerned about the environment after reading an article about plastic waste in the ocean.
I started really worrying that such a big problem wasn't getting enough attention and nobody would take action. I was terrified every time I thought about it, sometimes every 10 minutes. I couldn't concentrate on anything anymore.
China's rapid development has taken a huge toll on the environment. The country is now the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. Air quality is one of people's top concerns, but eco-activism is rare in China's repressive political system. The 16-year-old student has now been striking for 4 months. Her parents are worried about her future, but she has no intention to give in to their pleas to stop skipping classes.
The climate crisis is the biggest crisis ever for the existence of mankind. Everybody should do everything they can to prevent it.
Howie has asked a relative to let her plant the trees on his property. In China's densely populated countryside, it is not easy to find uncultivated land. The elderly farmer says he understands and supports the young activists.
It used to start getting cold in September, but now it's summer until October, November. Look at how warm it still is.
Howie says she has planted 200 trees in the past 6 weeks, but even more important to her is to raise awareness among China's youth. Today it's the farmer's son. She explains what climate change is, and he can join with young people around the world to stop it.
Tobita, I think you were going to just share some reflections on that clip. We felt it was important to share also because, of course, just 1 month after the COP, where we had such strong youth leadership, particularly from the movements, it's great to see also this leadership and a courageousness in China too. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Howie is definitely very courageous. She suffered some real consequences for her activism. I think she was basically kicked out of school as punishment for engaging in this climate activism. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, so it's an inspiring story, and you can see there the potential for greater grassroots engagement in climate issues in China in that video. But at the same time, the sort of repression that she faced can show like how difficult that can be. Like it is possible to have a civil society group working on environmental issues and climate issues in China, but you have to be careful to do it in a way that's in line with the state's priorities, and in particular, anything that's like a threat to social order is a real problem in the eyes of the state, and the kind of activism that Howie was engaged in is I guess was like very clearly seen as that kind of threat to social order. Yeah.
And perhaps I could widen that conversation a little bit to the other speakers, because I think a lot of people who've joined this whole series are involved in social movements and struggles around the world on different issues. And typically our movements have been most successful when we've been able to be internationalist, build alliances with other social movements, choose targets carefully, and make kind of strategic steps forward. And so I just wondering what your suggestion, and yet we also face obviously particular circumstances, political circumstances in China that might make some of that organizing, at least it has to be different, if not very difficult and challenging. So I'd welcome thoughts on how the international climate justice movement can work with Chinese people, Chinese communities, Chinese perspectives, Chinese leadership. You mentioned, Tobita, about subnational organizing. A lot of cities are starting to think what doing some of the most boldest plans. Are there other options and strategies that are worth pursuing? Perhaps I could, anyway, open to anyone who would like to comment on that. Isabel, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think I join the general view that this is becoming increasingly difficult. There is a Chinese Climate Action Network, youth movement, or at least there was. I'm not sure how active they are now. It's been very difficult for anyone to travel outside China because of COVID, extreme quarantine, very difficult for anyone to go into China. But I think that probably the difficulty is more political. There is, I think several of us have mentioned ultranationalism in China. and this is not a trivial issue. It means that it takes the form that the foreigner is responsible for everything bad that happens in China, and environmental. There was a piece a very nasty piece in Global Times, which is a nationalist newspaper, but state-affiliated, party-affiliated newspaper, which essentially said foreign NGOs are, a plot against China, and environmental NGOs are a plot against China, and that parallels an equally nasty piece in a right-wing publication here, which called environmentalists the useful idiots of the Chinese Communist Party. So you can see that we're suffering very much from the same spirit. And that makes it it adds a layer of hazard to anyone who wants to do any kind of international cooperation, because motives are questioned. There's also a general movement which is around culture and lifestyles. And that, I think, is going to make it quite difficult to have. I've seen some questions in the chat about, climate and lifestyle and vegetarianism and meat eating and so on. It's now almost impossible to suggest that, because that is also interpreted as foreigners telling Chinese they can't eat meat. And so any discussion on resources of that nature has become extremely difficult. And so I wouldn't really hold out a lot of hope for the kind of international cooperation that we could have seen and did see 10 years ago. It's pretty tough.
Anyone have anything to add to that, Hongqiao or Ying or Tobita?
Yeah, if I may add something. I think it's very interesting to observe that sometimes the government, the state would repress protest or complaint of that sort. That is actually consistent with what the government is doing. So I saw from this video really this strange contradiction that the girl was trying to plant trees, and that was considered as not appropriate. But at the same time, China, I think in my slide, I show that China actually launched this big afforestation movement since the 1990s. I have data here show that China now has 220 million hectares of forest, of which 40 million was planted since 1990s. So, this is really interesting. So it's not that the government doesn't want these things to be done. It's just that they want it to be done in their own way. So I think this is actually a very, it's almost like a consistent pattern that we can observe from other kind of policies as well. So I think like Isabel and Tobita was saying, this is more about social order and more about political incentive rather than not agreeing with this environmental concern in general. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have another question, which is about China's role in terms of exporting its carbon projects. There's one about the kind of thermal power plants on the Pakistan-China border. And China's, and of course we had the announcement just before COP26 of China ending coal financing. So would anyone like to share a bit more about China's role globally in terms of things like, and we've also touched on greening the BRI, what is underway, what is happening, and where could things be pushed, or where is there potential to kind of change or accelerate the kind of transition we need at a global level? Tobita or Hongqiao, would you like to add something on that?
Yeah, I can quickly answer on the coal power plant question, but I'm not the best person to comment on the overall BRI strategy. As I typed in the Q&A box, I think to start with, we have to acknowledge that there is this massive demand for energy in developing countries. in countries, for example, in Pakistan or a lot of African countries or in Latin America. And this demand for energy, this demand for development must be tackled one way or the other. And when there's not a lot of affordable finance in the market, China became the main target of campaigns about overseas coal power plants. But at the same time, there's also, the United States, Japan, Korea, China is part of that group, and because of the scale of its development, and also because of it came in as a later, player, it also captures more attention, I think. And we also have to distinguish direct state finance, for example, lending directly from state development banks, and also private involvements in such projects. So why do I mention all this? Is that even if there's no China, if China is not in the picture, this demand will have to be met. And before coal was the option, as it was in China itself, domestically, that coal was chosen as the option to meet its demand for energy and for development. And if there's no alternative to coal, if there's no alternative financing patterns to what China is offering today, I think a fundamental shift to move away from coal elsewhere, outside China, even China withdraw its investment for future, will still be difficult. And this is where transition finance can step in and play a role. And this is also where developed countries, the Roma, the Paris Club, or all the major donors can have a role to play. And unfortunately, it seems that in addition to existing international financing patterns, we haven't seen much more innovations to tackle this development needs from these countries. And another point that I want to make is that what is clear now from China is that it will not finance, or let's say stop, quote unquote, according to Xi Jinping, stop to build more coal power plants abroad. This, of course, is a very clear signal, at least to the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises and state development banks, and probably also to private banks and also other private sector players. But what to do with the existing lending that has already been put in place and be kind of materialized in terms of coal power plants? Will they be shut down overnight? Will there be a phase out or phase down plan? Will there be a transition fund to support this abatement of emissions from these coal power plants while meeting the demand for energy and the development of these host countries? And I think this is the real question. China is part of the problem, and is also the solution. It really depends on where you stand. And the last point I want to make is that shifting the focus from overseas coal power plants to nuclear or to any other non-fossil fuel energies is China's own interest, because as you can see, China is also the world's factory, not just in manufacturing, manufacturing, but also R&D, and also it's the giant in renewable energy development, in nuclear development, and it has become a successful business, and the coal is not, obviously. So it's to its own interest to participate more in this transition elsewhere, but also see it as an opportunity, investment opportunity for its own domestic manufacturing industry upgrades. And I will stop there and see if other panelists have contributions.
Thank you, Hongqiao. I think that you were starting to wrap up there, and I think it'd be great if we could have one just hear from the other three panelists, any kind of final concluding comments or remarks. And there was one specific question that perhaps you could answer, Tobita, which was talking about something I don't know about, but NRDC's work on the coal cap. which it's been with China. I don't know if that's something you can address, and whether the door to that kind of collaboration is being closed to NGOs, or whether that is kind of work that can be done. If you can address that, then do. Otherwise, if you have any final concluding remarks.
I do not know about that specific initiative, so I can't speak to that. I think, like as we've said before, the overall trend towards increasing nationalism and ultranationalism, both here and there, is making these kinds of efforts more difficult and susceptible to attack from ultra nationalist forces. But I think it is not like, I think there is still some potential there. Like, you have to be much more careful, and like that. This level of collaboration isn't something that I've been involved with directly, but I do know other environmental and climate groups that are engaged in this kind of work, and believe that there's real progress to be made. So yeah, I think it is an important track for us.
Thank you. Ying, any concluding comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, I just put in the chat that actually this organization, NRDC's founder, Barbara Finnemore, published a book on China's climate change policy, which I benefited a lot from. So I really recommend people, audience, to take a look if you have a chance. I think the speakers really have covered a lot of issues that are important and very much comprehensively. I probably would like to just add one thing about climate finance. I think recently there has been a lot of discussion on what is the most proper term to use. Should it be climate finance versus climate debt? Because using these different terms actually imply a very different understanding of the kind of responsibility, the kind of obligation that countries from the developed camp versus from the developing camp should assume. So I think this is actually a very important issue. I think I mentioned that the developed world so far hasn't fulfilled the promise on climate finance. I think largely based on, because this understanding that historical responsibility has already, history is history, right? We need to focus on now who is the current emitter, and therefore all this climate finance mechanism is largely based on voluntary contribution. There's not much rigorous calculation on who should contribute in what proportion. So I think in that way, it's not a binding really obligation at all. But if we can shift the narrative, if like more people are joining in shaping the narrative to the point that historical responsibility is important and some of the unequal structure still persists, and therefore instead of voluntary contribution, there should be an obligation to support countries in the global south in terms of climate debt, rather than a favor, a gift, as is implied by climate finance term. I think that would be really important and helpful to push the environmental movement to a new level. So that's what I want to add.
Thank you so much, Ying. Finally, Isabel.
Thank you very much, Nick. And thank you for organizing this, by the way. I should have said that earlier. It's been a great pleasure to be sharing a platform with such great speakers. I just wanted to pick up a couple of things which are really to do with Belt and Road and greening the Belt and Road and the coal cancellation. The coal cancellation, is important. It wasn't exactly a forward policy, since a lot of host countries had begun to cancel these projects anyway. If you look at Kenya or even Pakistan, they were understanding that there was a huge risk of building stranded assets or complicating their own climate trajectory. What will matter, though, is the second part of Xi Jinping's announcement, which is that not only would China no longer finance new coal on the Belt and Road, but it would support countries to build renewable systems. Why has this not happened before? Well, part of this is about the structure of Chinese finance. Big state-owned enterprises like coal companies and infrastructure companies have a very privileged access to Chinese finance. So they can go abroad, they can take risks, and they will get backing from state banks, partly because they have large installations in China that can be used as collateral for that kind of investment abroad. And they're not great at calculating risk, but it sort of hasn't mattered because they haven't had a lot of exposure because of the state support. Renewables companies tended to be private. They tended to be smaller. They didn't have that kind of privileged access to finance, and they didn't have large installations or establishments in China that could be used as collateral. So they faced enormous barriers in going out along the Belt and Road. Now, with this announcement, what I would look for, if I were looking at the seriousness or not of this announcement, is what is the Chinese state and the Chinese finance system going to do to correct that imbalance and really to support both the Chinese companies that have the capacity and the technology to help emerging economies build renewable systems, but also the kind of aid and support that emerging economies themselves, that host countries will need in order to build and manage the rather more complicated task of building an distributed renewable system. If we see that developing, then we will know that China is really serious and is really capitalizing on the skills that it has, and that's a benefit to everybody.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Well, this concludes our final webinar, but before people go, I want to just put up a survey because this is the final of our webinar series, and we would really love to hear from you. And some of you may have filled in this survey last week, but if you didn't, if you could fill it in today, we just want to have some feedback about how to take this forward. So I'm just going to put that up for a minute before concluding this session. If 1 means you're not so interested, and 5 means you're very interested in it. And there are 2 questions. So please, if you haven't filled this in last week, do fill it in, as this will give us some clues about where to go next. We've loved the series, but we want to know what you think and what you think we should be doing. And while you're filling that in, I just wanted to say that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted along with all the other webinars on TNI's YouTube channel, and we'll put the link in the chat. We've really appreciated and we'll share in a moment once this poll done, all the people who've participated in the series. It really came together thanks to the kind, generous support and analysis of the speakers like you heard today, who gave their time freely to share their insights and perspectives. And we've all been enriched immensely by that. And I think if one of the messages that came through today is that extreme nationalism, wherever it takes place, whether it's anti-Chinese or within China, is stopping us take the kind of action that we do need, internationalism. So these kind of exchanges, hearing from different voices, people who know China well, and many Chinese people themselves, are really at least one step towards the kind of internationalist solutions that we need. I want to thank also the small team of people who put this series together, particularly Jess and Steph in TNI, and also Kevin Lin, Darren Byler, Ralph Ruckus, and Sophie. They were the kind of initial coordinating team who helped us find people and kind of put this whole series together. We hope you found them useful. If you do have any suggestions or proposals in addition to the poll of how we might follow up, please do email me. My email will be put in the chat, nick@tni.org. It's not part of our series, this China series, but we are, for those who aren't webinared out, we have a really fascinating webinar tomorrow on Chile's new constitution, which I can highly recommend, organized with us and some Chilean organizations. which is looking at the new constitution and what it means for the rights of care workers and what a feminist national care system might look like. The webinar is going to be held at 3 p.m. tomorrow, Central European time, and the link again will be posted in the chat. So do join us then. All these webinars we put together are free because we believe this information is critical for activists and should be freely available, but it does cost money to put together. So we really appreciate it if at the end of your giving, you would consider supporting TNI by making a donation. At the very least, sign up to our newsletter to make sure you're in touch with what we do. You can also follow more issues like this in our podcast series. A final thank you to Isabel, to Ying, to Hongqiao, and to Tobita for today. It was I learned a huge amount. I hope you did too. And we look forward to see you on a future occasion. Thank you all.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, the team. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Thanks
everyone.